This video is about the cardiovascular system. We're going to start with blood, and then we'll look at the heart and some of the functions of the blood, its components, and the heart, its anatomy, and blood pressure in this video. Let's start with components of blood. Blood consists of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and then the plasma is the liquid part of the blood. Now, blood works to regulate, protect, and transport. Regulate what? Well, things like pH, for example. Protect what? Well, white blood cells protect from bacterial infections. Transport what? Well, things like carbon dioxide to the lungs to be exhaled, nutrients, oxygen. The normal pH of blood is 7.2. If that pH gets too high or too low, then bad things start to happen, because acidic pHs or basic pHs will denature proteins. That means the proteins will lose their shape. When the proteins lose their shape, they lose their function. So it's very important that the pH of blood stay pretty close to that 7.2 number. Blood consists of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. That makes the blood tissue because it's made of more than one type of cell. The life cycle of blood starts in the bone marrow, where the red bone marrow produces red blood cells. Now, those cells differentiate into either red blood cells, white blood cells, or platelets, depending on what the body needs. There are several different types of white blood cells. White blood cells make up most of our immune defense. Neutrophils are large white blood cells. They engulf bacteria by endocytosis, and they produce things like pus when they fill up with bacteria that they've been engulfing and then end up dying because they're trying to fight this infection. So pus is often a sign of infection because neutrophils are rushing to that site of infection. Eosinophils attack parasites and sometimes are related to allergies. Monocytes are, again, large cells. They are called macrophages because they're eating by endocytosis. They just engulf foreign objects and foreign organisms that might be in the body. Basophils release histamines. Histamines are often what we associate with allergic reactions. So we say, I have an allergy to pollen. Well, there's nothing about pollen that hurts us. It's the histamines that the basophils are releasing that causes the runny nose, the watery eyes, and the shortness of breath. Lymphocytes are more specific. They target certain invaders. So that's our immune response. Erythrocytes are red blood cells. Leukocytes are white blood cells. Erythrocytes, red blood cells, have a biconcave disc shape. You can see that in the picture. That creates a lot of surface area so that they can carry a lot of oxygen. They're produced by the bone marrow. They circulate for about 4 months and then are destroyed by the liver. Red blood cells have an affinity for oxygen. That is, they attach to oxygen, they carry it, and then they release it to the tissues that need it. They pick up carbon dioxide, release it in the lungs. But carbon monoxide has too much of an affinity. So when a red blood cell latches onto a carbon monoxide, it has a hard time letting it go. That's why when a person is experiencing carbon monoxide poisoning, their blood oxygen levels are dropping, they feel drowsy and sleepy, they eventually go to sleep and they don't wake up. Hemoglobin is a protein. That IN tells me that it's a protein, and it's what carries the oxygen. So there's a iron part of the hemoglobin and this bilirubin part of the hemoglobin. And that protein carries oxygen around. Bilirubin is kind of a yellowish pigment. And so as red blood cells are destroyed in the liver, they release that bilirubin. It's collected by the liver, injected into the gallbladder, and then released into the digestive system. But if that yellow starts to build up in tissues because it's not being filtered by the liver, it's an indication that the liver is failing. That's called jaundice. Blood cells can be typed by blood group. This is especially useful for blood transfusions. One way to type blood is A, B, and O. Another way to type blood is Rh positive or Rh negative. They're two separate blood typing methods, but we all often combine them into one when we say A positive. Type A blood has an A protein marker on it. That protein marker is called an antigen. It's kind of like a identification card. So type A blood has the type A identification card. Type B blood has a type B identification, that protein marker. Type AB blood has both, and type O blood has none. Why is that identification marker important? Well, it helps the body recognize what blood cells belong to itself and what blood cells are foreign. So in the plasma are antibodies. The antibodies are looking for blood that's foreign. So type A blood has anti-B antibodies. It's like security guards. So the security guards are just checking the ID cards, and if the ID card matches up as self, they don't do anything. But if it doesn't match up and they tag it as foreign, then it causes the blood cells to clump up because of these antibodies grouping around those cells, causing agglutination or clumping, clotting of the blood. Type B blood has the anti-A antibodies, so their security is on the lookout for type A blood because it doesn't belong. Now, AB blood has no security. There's no antibodies. Type O has very tight security. It will recognize any foreign blood and it won't accept it. Because of this, type O blood is often considered the universal donor. Without any kind of chemical marker to identify it, it can slip past the security of all the other blood groups. Type AB blood is considered the universal recipient. Because it has no security, it can take blood from all the other blood groups. What happens when you get a cut or scrape and you start to bleed? Well, the first thing is that your body responds by squeezing that wound shut. That allows the platelets to sort of block up that area and to start the clot formation. The clot formation begins when prothrombin, that's a protein, is converted to thrombin. Fibrinogen is converted to fibrin. That creates kind of this net. That net collects more blood cells. The blood cells then begin to clot. That clot blocks the hole, and some healing can begin. After the process of healing, the blood clot needs to be dissolved, and another protein called plasmin dissolves the blood clot so the blood flows normally once more. Arteries are different than veins. Both are blood vessels, but they're different. Arteries are way more muscular, they're way more elastic, they expand, they have no valves. Veins have valves. Veins go away from the heart, and those valves help prevent backflow. Veins also have a muscular layer, but they're not nearly as elastic. So arteries have very high pressure, so that's why there needs to be that elasticity. So think of artery away from the heart. Think of vein, valve. And the way that helps you is that arteries go away. That means veins must go toward the heart. Veins have valves to prevent backflow. Arteries are elastic because of the high pressure of blood moving through an artery. Arteries are typically deeper in the body. And when it comes to the names of arteries and the names of veins, often they're named very similarly. So the brachial vein and the brachial artery run side by side. The hepatic vein going to the liver, the hepatic artery. The renal artery, renal veins going to the kidneys. The femoral artery in your upper thigh, the femoral vein in your upper thigh. So most arteries and veins have names that correspond. There are a few exceptions, like the jugular vein drains the blood in the head, whereas the carotid arteries are taking the blood up to the brain. The vena cava is the large blood vessel that supplies the heart, whereas the aorta is the artery. The vena cava is the blood vessel that's bringing blood from the body to the heart, whereas the aorta is the major blood vessel taking blood away from the heart. The heart is a muscle. It's cardiac muscle. There's 3 layers. Epicardium is the outer layer. Myocardium is a muscular kind of inside layer. And the endocardium is what's lining the chambers of the heart. Here's a picture of the heart. It consists of atriums and ventricles. Whenever you're looking at a heart to identify it, remember that you're identifying the patient's heart, not your heart. So the left atrium is the patient's left, and the left ventricle is the patient's left. The right ventricle is the patient's right. Atrium are little chambers where blood enters. Think of it kind of like a foyer. So blood enters this little atrium. It's going to be like a holding area before it moves through valves into the ventricles. When the heart pumps and blood leaves the ventricles, they're either going to go to the lungs or they're going to go to the body. The valves of the heart are named based on their locations. So if it's atrioventricular, it's between the atrium and the ventricle. So the right AV valve is between the right atrium and the right ventricle. The semilunar valves, the valves that release blood from the heart, are named based on the blood vessel they're attached to. So the pulmonary semilunar is the gateway to the pulmonary artery. The aortic semilunar is the gateway to the aorta. Semilunar valves are kind of like half-moon shapes, and that's how they got their name. The vena cava is broken down to superior, that's the above part, the part above the heart. The inferior vena cava is below the heart, and that brings blood into the right atrium. The aorta is taking blood away. The pulmonary arteries are taking blood to the lungs, and the pulmonary veins are bringing blood from the lungs. The reason those two are so significant is the pulmonary artery is the only artery that's carrying blood without oxygen. The pulmonary veins are the only veins that have blood with oxygen because they're coming directly from the lungs. The first exits, if you think of the aorta like a major interstate, the first 3 exits are the brachiocephalic, which goes to the right side of the body and then branches to the head and to the arm. The left common carotid, which goes up the left side of the neck to the brain, and the left subclavian, which goes below the clavicle to the arm. The septum divides the ventricles. This keeps oxygenated blood from mixing with deoxygenated blood. The heart also needs blood. So not just the body needs blood, but so does the heart. So that's called coronary circulation. If the blood is going to the lungs, that's called pulmonary circulation. And if it's going to the body, it's called systemic circulation. But the heart's a muscle. It needs blood too. The problem is that the coronary arteries often clog with plaque. So cholesterol builds up on the artery walls. It keeps the arteries from being able to expand, like they lose some of their elasticity, but also starts to occlude the artery, blocks it, so that blood has a hard time getting through there. Well, if blood can't get to your heart, then your heart muscle can't contract without that oxygen supplying that energy through aerobic respiration, and the heart stops. We call that a heart attack. So pulmonary circulation to the lungs and back, systemic circulation to the body and back, to the body systems. The cardiac cycle is a cycle, so it doesn't really matter where it starts, but it starts with, let's say, diastole. Diastole is a relaxation. So the atrium are relaxing, which means they're filling. Then the atrium will enter a systolic phase, or systole, where they contract. While the atrium are filling, the ventricles are contracting. Then the ventricles are filling. That's ventricular diastole. Ventricles contract. That's ventricular systole. So whenever you think of the heart, think of the atrium contracting, then the ventricles contracting. So it kind of works like this. The atrium are contracting as the ventricles are filling. The ventricles are contracting while the atrium are filling. The one is in a relaxed state, diastole. The other is in a contracted state, systole. Cardiac output is a mathematical equation to figure out how much blood is coming out of one side of the heart every minute. So cardiac output equals the heart rate times the stroke volume. Heart rate is just a number of beats per minute. The stroke volume is the amount of blood that's coming out with each heartbeat. So let's say it's 75 beats per minute, and it's beating or it's releasing 70 milliliters of blood. We're just going to multiply 75 times 70. That's the cardiac output. If you know the cardiac output and the heart rate, you can determine the stroke volume by doing a little division. One side of the heart, if the cardiac output is what blood comes out of one side of the heart each minute, if the heart rate is 70 and the stroke volume is 75, then out of one side of the heart is going to come one 2-liter bottle worth of blood, a second 2-liter bottle worth of blood, and then a liter bottle worth of blood, and then a smaller 250 milliliter container filled with blood. That's a lot of blood, well over 5 liters of blood every minute. If the heart is beating super slow, under 60 beats per minute, that's going to affect the cardiac output. Cardiac output is going to decrease significantly. If the heart is beating super fast, over 100 beats per minute, that also decreases the cardiac output, but not in the way you would think. It decreases the cardiac output because the heart's beating so fast that the chambers don't have a chance to fill, so the stroke volume goes way down. Nerves help stimulate heartbeats. The sinoatrial nerve, or the SA node, is the pacemaker of the heart. It sets the rhythm of the heart, the constant beat of the heart. So when the sinoatrial node fires, it goes around the atrium and the atrium contract. That contraction stimulates the atrioventricular node to send a signal down through the septum, around the ventricles, and the ventricles contract. So we can monitor this electrical conduction system by an EKG or ECG. Now, the electrical impulses could be traveling around the heart, but that doesn't necessarily mean the heart is actually contracting. Generally speaking, whenever those impulses go to those heart muscles, those muscles will contract. We can read that EKG by looking at the different waves. The P wave tells us that the atrium contracts. The QRS wave tells us that the ventricles contract. The T wave tells us that the ventricles relax. Well, we're missing something. We're missing the atrium relaxing. Well, the atrium relaxed during the QRS complex. So we see the atrium contract, but we don't see it relax, because when the ventricles contract, it's such a mammoth electrical event, it overrides the smaller atrium relaxation. When we look at an EKG, we can look for these 4 main things: rate, rhythm, hypertrophy, and blocks. So we're just looking at the waves. The first thing we want to notice is the heart rate normal? Are we getting the correct number of waves across the EKG strip? If so, the heart's 70 beats, 80 beats, 90 beats a minute. It's within the normal range. It's a good rate. What about the rhythm? Well, the heart might have 70 beats per minute, but it might sound like bup, 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 bup. So the rhythm is all wrong. So that way you're checking regular intervals to see if the heart has a regular rhythm. If so, it's probably the SA node is working correctly. If not, there's probably something wrong in the SA node. Hypertrophy just means that the heart's working way too hard to contract. So the waves are taller than normal. And blocks mean that the waves are longer than normal. So something's blocking that electrical conduction system. A normal heart rate for an infant is around 120 beats per minute. For a teenager, between 80 and 95, and adults between 70 and 80. Normal blood pressure hovers around 120. That's the systolic pressure. 80 is the diastolic pressure. So whenever your heart beats, as that blood leaves the heart and enters the arteries, it expands those arteries. We feel that as our pulse. The pressure it takes to expand those arteries, that's systolic pressure. Then once that blob of blood kind of moves through that section of artery, it begins to A decrease of that pressure is the diastolic pressure while the ventricles are at rest. Blood pressure is sometimes called the silent killer, so hypertension, this high blood pressure. And that's because that blood is constantly pounding against your tissues. If it's higher than normal, it's doing a lot of damage to your tissues. You don't even feel it. You don't recognize that it's even happening. So that's why every time you go to the doctor, even if it's for a cold, they take your blood pressure. What are they doing? Well, what they do is they put the cuff on your arm. They're going to squeeze that blood vessel shut. And then they're going to listen. So gradually they release that pressure to listen for the first time they hear blood flowing through that blood vessel. The first time they start to hear it, they look on their sphygmomanometer to see what pressure that is, and that's your systolic pressure. Well, they keep listening. As they gradually release the pressure of that cuff, the artery is going to go back to its normal shape. As it does, the last time they hear any noises, that's going to be the diastolic pressure. So they close it, they don't hear anything, and they're listening. That's the first noise they hear. They're going to look at that gauge. That's the high number, the systolic pressure. Then they're listening. They don't hear anything. When they don't hear anything, that's the diastolic pressure. In this case, the person's blood pressure is 120. That's when they first hear the sounds. And if you look down where the curve is dropping off, that's 80, where they stop hearing the sounds. Now, there are some different factors that affect blood pressure. Cardiac output and heart rate affect blood pressure, because if that goes up, so does the blood pressure. Peripheral resistance just means how much friction there is against the artery walls. So high blood pressure could be caused by an increase in that friction. So maybe that's because their arteries are clogged, or maybe that's because the arteries have gotten really long because we've gained an extra 10 pounds. So we've got an increased network of arteries that increases the resistance. Blood volume has to do with how much blood we have. So let's say we're eating a lot of salt. That salt causes a lot of water retention. That increases our blood volume. That's going to increase our blood pressure. Blood viscosity has to do with how thick our blood is. So if our blood is thick, then it's going to create a lot of friction. That's going to increase our blood pressure. If our blood is thinner, then it flows easier, a lot less friction. So sometimes people take an aspirin because that thins their blood, and that helps lower their blood pressure. So what can you do to lower your blood pressure if you have problems with blood pressure? Well, it might be genetic, but there might be some things that you can do. For example, you can eat less sodium, definitely eat more vegetables, quit smoking, because smoking is a vasodilator. It shrinks blood vessels, which increases the pressure, kind of like when you put your thumb over a hose. Lose some weight, because that's going to reduce those extra blood vessels necessary. And then get some regular exercise to strengthen your heart rate and your cardiac output. I hope that helps you understand a little bit more about the cardiovascular system, blood, and how it works. Thank you for watching.